Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're really getting into a case that, well, for a lot of people, it just defined that early 2000s media frenzy.
hmm
Talking about the Scott and Laci Peterson case. It's become almost a blueprint for these really tough, nobody, no weapon murder convictions.
Exactly. And it's such a striking example of how a prosecution can be built almost entirely on things like motive, behavior, and just a mountain of circumstantial details. So our mission today is to unpack the facts, maybe look beyond what you think you remember, delve into the forensics, which were complicated, and track these legal challenges that are, believe it or not, still going on.
Still going on decades later. Okay, let's lay down some basics, just the really crucial stuff. Laci and Scott Peterson, they projected this, perfect couple image. Met in 94, married in 97, moved to Modesto in 2000 specifically to start their family. And by 2002, Laci's pregnant with Connor, due February 2003.
Right. But beneath that surface, Skit was leading a double life. Prosecutors later argued he'd been unfaithful basically since 97. But the really critical part starts November 2002. He begins this affair with Amber Frey, a massage therapist from Fresno.
And he tells her he's single.
Worse, by December 9th, just a couple of weeks before Laci vanishes, he'd already told Amber he was a widower. He literally set the stage.
Wow. Okay, so that brings us to the day, December 24th, 2002, Christmas Eve. Scott's story is he last saw Laci around 9:30 in the morning. She's watching Martha Stewart prepping to bake, mop the floor, walk the dog. Just a normal day. He claims he then drove, 90 miles?
90 miles, yeah, to the Brickley Marina to go fishing. Alone.
But that timeline starts falling apart pretty quickly, doesn't it? Starting with the dog walk.
It does. A neighbor, Karen Service, finds their golden retriever, Mackenzie, just wandering outside. The leash is muddy. This is key. She puts the dog back in their yard sometime between 10:20 and 10:30 a.m.
Okay, so if the dog's out with a muddy leash by 10:30 a.m.,
It strongly suggests Laci was likely gone by then. Not later in the day, as Scott's fishing alibi might imply.
right. Then Scott leaves Laci a voicemail at 2:15 p.m., says he's heading back from Berkeley, gets home, empty house. And the source mentioned something interesting when he called Laci's mom, Sharon Rocha. He didn't mention the dog being found outside earlier.
That omission became significant later. He and Laci's stepfather officially report her missing just before 6 p.m. that evening.
The investigation kicks off immediately. Huge media attention right from the start. Police go in.
And they find Laci's keys, her wallet, purse, sunglasses, all just sitting in a closet. Things you'd normally take with you if you left voluntarily. And what's really interesting here is what caught the detective's attention first. It wasn't necessarily physical evidence of a struggle.
It was Scott himself.
It was Scott's behavior. Detectives Burkini and Bueller, they found him suspicious almost immediately.
Why? What was it about him?
Bueller described him as having this calm, cool demeanor, but also a lack of questioning. You'd expect someone whose pregnant wife is missing to be frantic, asking questions. Scott apparently wasn't. Bueller called it a strange combination of polite and arrogant, almost disaffected.
And that initial gut feeling from the police gets a huge boost just 6 days later.
Huge. December 30th, Amber Frey comes forward. She reveals Scott's months-long lie, the whole widower story. That was the bombshell.
And she agrees to help the police.
Yes, she starts recording her phone calls with Scott. They were hoping, obviously, he might slip up, maybe confess something. By mid-January 2003, the police tell Laci's immediate family about the affair.
That must have been devastating.
Absolutely. And according to reports, Laci's mother, Sharon Rocha, told detectives right then she believed Scott had killed Laci. Soon after, the family publicly withdrew their support for Scott, pointing to his lack of cooperation in the search.
Then the grim discovery in April 2003.
Yeah, the remains start washing ashore. First, Connor, the fetus. Then separately, Laci's torso, found on the tidal flats of San Francisco Bay near Richmond's Point, Isabel. That officially turns it into a homicide investigation.
The forensic details must have been incredibly difficult, given the condition of the remains.
Very challenging. The autopsy confirmed it was Laci, obviously, but her body was severely decomposed. Missing head, arms, legs, most internal organs. The medical examiner noted 2 cracked ribs and cracked neck bones. But crucially, Dr. Peterson found no human-made cuts or incisions.
So not like a stabbing or something easily identifiable.
Exactly. The condition was consistent with the body that had been weighted down, submerged in the bay for months. And Connor, the autopsy showed he died in utero and was naturally expelled as Laci's body decomposed underwater. A natural, though horrifying, process.
So if they can't determine how she was killed, the focus shifts to disposal. How did Scott allegedly get the body into the bay?
This is where the anchors come in. The prosecution's theory was that Scott made homemade concrete anchors to weigh her body down. The evidence. In his warehouse, police found things like cement powder, what looked like a mold for an anchor, and 5 circular marks on the floor, like bucket marks.
Okay, so circumstantial evidence suggesting he made anchors.
Right. They alleged he made 5. But here's a massive point the defense hammered on, and you need to grasp this. They searched the bay. Extensively, they used sonar, sophisticated enough they said it could find a tin can on the bottom.
And they found 0 anchors.
0. Not one of the 5 alleged anchors was ever recovered. That's a pretty big hole in the physical evidence chain, you know?
Definitely. So if the whole disposal theory hinges on these anchors, and you can't find any, how does the prosecution push forward so strongly? How do they convince a jury?
Well, they used Scott's behavior again to kind of fill that gap. And his actions around the time of his arrest certainly didn't look good for him. He's arrested April 18th, 2003. Not at home, but near the Mexican border at a golf course.
And the details of that arrest were pretty damning, weren't they?
Oh, yeah. He dyed his hair and beard blonde. He had almost $15,000 in cash on him. Viagra, survival gear. And not just his driver's license, but his brother's too.
That screams flight risk, though his dad argued it was just to avoid the insane media attention.
His father did argue that, but the police and prosecution presented it as clear evidence of guilt and intent to flee. It painted a picture.
So the trial gets moved because of all the publicity.
Right, to San Mateo County. And it becomes this masterclass in building a case on circumstantial evidence. No murder weapon found. No eyewitness to the crime itself. The anchor evidence is purely theoretical, so the prosecution leans heavily on the pattern. Scott's affair with Amber, his lies telling people different stories about where he was, like golfing instead of fishing, his apparent lack of emotion.
And the Amber Frey tapes must have been powerful in court.
Devastating. Hearing his voice telling those lies. There was one call played where he actually claimed he was calling her from Paris while the search for Laci was in full swing. Plus, they had that one piece of forensic evidence, a single hair found on pliers in Scott's boat.
The hair evidence, I remember that.
Yeah, the FBI used mitochondrial DNA testing, which isn't as precise as nuclear DNA, to match it to Laci's hairbrush. The defense, of course, challenged the reliability of mtDNA evidence.
But the defense, led by Mark Geragos, they did land some punches, didn't they? They argued the police just zeroed in on Scott too fast.
They definitely did. Their main strategy was reasonable doubt focus on the lack of direct evidence and claim the police had tunnel vision, ignoring other leads or possibilities. And they had that one really memorable moment in court, the aha moment, you could call it.
The Martha Stewart show.
Exactly. The police had tried to discredit Scott's alibi, partly by saying the TV show he claimed Laci was watching didn't actually feature a segment on meringues that morning. Geragos dramatically played the tape of the show in court, proving it did include meringues. It showed the police had gotten a detail wrong in their rush to build a case against Scott.
So a point for the defense, showing police error, but ultimately...
Ultimately, it wasn't enough. In November 2004, the jury convicted Scott. First-degree murder for Laci, second-degree for Connor. And jurors said afterwards it wasn't one single thing. It was, quote, hundreds of small puzzle pieces of circumstantial evidence, the affair, the lies, the timing, and yes, his demeanor that convinced them.
The case also had ripples beyond the courtroom, didn't it? Legislatively.
It did. It was a direct catalyst for the Unborn Victims of Violence Act, passed in 2004. It's often called Laci and Connor's Law.
But the legal story for Scott Peterson himself was far from over. His conviction stands, but the death sentence, that was overturned much later, in 2020.
Correct. And it's important to understand why. It wasn't based on innocence or new evidence about the crime itself. The California Supreme Court found a serious error during jury selection.
What was the error?
The trial judge had dismissed potential jurors who expressed opposition to the death penalty, but crucially, the judge didn't adequately determine if they could actually set aside those personal beliefs and follow the law as required. That violated Scott's right to an impartial jury on the penalty phase. So the conviction was upheld, but the death sentence was thrown out.
So he was resentenced.
Yes, in 2021. He was resentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, which is where he stands now in terms of his sentence.
But even that wasn't the end of the legal challenges. There was the habeas corpus petition route.
Right. Habeas corpus allows inmates to challenge their conviction based on issues outside the trial record, like juror misconduct or new evidence. The first big swing was alleging juror misconduct. The claim was that one juror, Rochelle Nice, had lied during jury selection, specifically about her own history with domestic violence.
Why did that matter?
The argument was that her alleged lies showed bias and prevented Scott from having a fair trial. The state attorney general's office fought back hard, pointing to the, quote, overwhelming evidence of guilt presented at trial. But in December 2022, Judge Anne-Christine Masulo denied that petition. She found the jurors' inconsistent answers weren't intentional lies, but resulted from good faith misunderstanding and maybe some sloppiness on the questionnaire. No evidence of actual bias was found.
Okay, so that challenge failed, but then the LA Innocence Project gets involved.
Exactly.
That's pretty significant.
Very significant. The LAIP taking on a case like this, which relies so heavily on circumstantial evidence and behavior, means they believe there's a potential avenue through objective scientific proof. They formally took his case in early 2024. Their focus seems to be on potential third-party involvement in physical evidence that might have been missed or misinterpreted.
And they had some success recently with DNA testing.
They did. In May 2024, a judge granted their motion for DNA testing on a very specific item, a piece of duct tape. This tape was found on Laci's pants during the autopsy back in 2003.
Duct tape.
Mm-hmm.
After all this time, what's the theory there?
Well, the hope for the defense, obviously, is that testing this tape might reveal DNA from an unknown individual. If it does, it could potentially support their argument that someone else was involved, maybe in the abduction, murder, or disposal of the body. It opens up that third-party killer theory they've pushed.
That's fascinating. A tiny piece of evidence from 2 decades ago could potentially shift the narrative.
Potentially. And adding to that, in October 2024, the defense won another round, gaining access to post-conviction discovery, basically, getting their hands on evidence files they claim were previously withheld. However, it's not all wins. The appeals court did deny the LAIP's main habeas corpus petition in June 2025. So while DNA testing moves forward, the bigger legal pathway to overturn the conviction itself is still facing major hurdles.
So this case just keeps evolving. It really underscores the difficulty, doesn't it? Prosecuting a murder without that smoking gun, without the anchors, without knowing exactly how she died. Instead, you have this narrative built piece by piece from circumstantial details and, crucially, from how Scott Peterson acted.
It absolutely does. And it really puts the legal system, and maybe us observers, in a tough spot. You have the state AG saying there's overwhelming evidence of guilt, yet you also have a respected group like the LA Innocence Project fighting for access to objective DNA testing, suggesting there are still unanswered scientific questions.
Which brings us back to the listener. What does this all mean for you? Scott Peterson's conviction seems inseparable from the interpretation of his behavior. The dyed hair, the lies, that infamous cool demeanor, all amplified by this intense media storm. So think about that. When a case relies so heavily on interpreting actions versus hard physical proof, what does that intense media spotlight do? Does it help find truth, or does it potentially cloud the search for objective facts in the courtroom?
What questions still linger for you about how much a compelling narrative or a defendant's perceived lack of empathy should weigh against, say, missing anchors or untested DNA?
A really provocative thought to leave you with.
Indeed.
Thanks for diving deep with us today.